Hi, everybody. The Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice welcomes you to this series, This is America, a series of conversations about racial slavery, its legacies, and anti-Black racism. And today we convene in a panel of experts, scholars and activists for today's topic, breaking the thin blue line of bigotry, how outcries for police reform have led to the call for abolition. And I'm excited to say we have about 700 people today logging on to talk about this important topic. My name is Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, and I'm a fellow here at the Center for Slavery and Justice, as well as an associate faculty in the Department of Sociology at Brown University. And as you may know, my research in the book Crook County examines how overt racism was culturally practiced in all facets of the criminal justice system, looking most closely at courts, but looking at jails and policing, how mostly white attorneys, police, and often sheriff's officers created racist narratives about Black and Brown immorality to streamline convictions at all costs in Chicago, the largest unified court system in the US. And at the time, people said Chicago was the only place or must be the worst jurisdiction. But what we've seen is this is a nationwide problem. And police were omnipresent in the work. DAs were often admitting to racist police practices, planting drugs on defendants, and in the worst case, beating or killing suspects. DAs were expected to comply with police's stories of events, and none were charged for their crimes. This is what I call the thin blue line of bigotry, a code of silence and violence that allowed for the harming of Black and Latino defendants and the compliance of law enforcement and even attorneys to sustain such practices. So now we fast forward to the death of George Floyd, and we see an officer brazenly looking at the camera, his hands in his pockets as he defiantly killed Mr. Floyd, despite the desperate pleas of onlookers. This officer knew what many of us scholars as well as activists have researched and experienced is that an entire system, a culture, would protect such abuse and even murder. So today we are going to go deep and we're going to discuss these dynamics with this amazing panel of experts that I want to introduce to you. I want to thank them first for coming. And so we welcome and thank Professor Monica Bell. She's an associate professor of law at Yale Law School and an associate professor of sociology at Yale University. Her areas of expertise include criminal justice, welfare law, housing, race, and the law, qualitative research methods, and law and sociology. Some of her recent work has been published in Yale Law Review, Law and Society Review, and the Annual Review of Law and Social Science. She is a prolific public scholar with her writing featured in the Washington Post and the LA Review of Books, to name a few. She holds degrees from Furman University, University College Dublin, Yale Law School, and Harvard University. Professor Brittany Friedman is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Born in Blood, Death, Work, White Power, and the Rise of the Black Guerrilla Family, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press in the special series, Justice, Power, and Politics. Her book examines the institutional practices of white supremacy within prison, resulting strategies to eradicate Black protest and the racially violent consequences for prison social systems. Professor Friedman holds a PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. Marco A. McWilliams is a public historian, a published writer, and activist with nearly 2 decades of engaged scholarship work in convening diverse learning communities. He was the founding instructor for the influential Black Studies program at DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality. His research focuses on Black history through the framework of Black radical tradition of thought. Mr. McWilliams has taught and workshopped broadly in colleges, middle schools, high schools, organization, and interfaith communities. He's currently a program director and educator at Brown University's Swearer Center, where he was the 2017 Junior Fellow Practitioner in Residence. Mr. McWilliams has a BA in Africana Studies from Rhode Island College, and in 2020, he begins graduate school in the Department of American Studies at Brown University. Dr. Chris Roberts has earned his PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple University and an MA in Ethnic Studies from San Francisco State University. He is a current Center for Social Equity and Inclusion Research Fellow. He examines Black geographies of memory and forgetting with an emphasis on port cities in the US that anchored the transatlantic and domestic slave trade. prior to teaching at RISD, he's taught at Brown University, where he was an Erasmus A.W. and a Martha Jankowski postdoctoral fellow at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. Before that, he taught at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey, and Temple University in Philadelphia. So I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone here. It's really an honor to be on this panel. And I think right now it is such a tough time. And I wanted to start the panel where we often don't go. And as you segue into telling us a little bit about your research, but if we can start with Professor Bell, we'll go down the entire line. If you can introduce yourself to the listeners who are zooming in, and tell us about your research, but also tell us emotionally how this time has been for you and what your kind of visceral reaction has been to the current events. So Professor Bell.
Sure, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and share space with all of you. I think the main kind of point I would like to talk about is, and maybe I'll actually start with the end of your question, the kind of emotional part, which is that it's been a really difficult time on multiple levels, mostly having to do in part with the fact that people are just kind of realizing the depth of the racism that is endemic to a lot of what police do. And that, like, I've actually been taken aback and surprised by how many people I've had conversations with who seem surprised. Like, there's been nothing about this that is surprising to me. That relates a lot to the research I've been doing for the past nearly a decade, that I've organized more recently around a concept of legal estrangement. And essentially what that idea is that instead of looking at communities of color and thinking, why don't they trust the police, and how do we build the trust between Black communities and the police, instead the framework is to examine how various institutions of the state, with the police being often the front face of the state in Black communities, especially in urban communities, examining how those institutions engage in processes of exclusion that are subjectively felt by people kind of in those communities and in those places. And that change of lens is really important for thinking about the types of interventions you might do. So for many decades, we have been, and I don't know who the we is, it doesn't really include me, but okay. But someone has been trying to engage in certain processes of police reform that really focus on individual interactions between the police and kind of singular individuals, with this idea that if you make those fair and just, that the kind of individual fairness will bleed out into structural fairness. But it's really clear that that's not the case, because the function of policing is fundamentally flawed in such a way that the racial control and the various structures and ideological positionalities of policing make it impossible to reform in that way. You need much more fundamental transformation. One of the things that's been really exciting to me, so I'm not just alarmed by how new racism is to people, but I'm also hopeful, in part because for the first time, we've really started to see conversations that take into account the deep rootedness of, and the kind of the possibility of bifurcating the ideas of public safety from policing. There's been this narrative in which they flow together. And I think we're finally starting to have really hard conversations about what public safety looks like without relying on the police to do it. So I'll stop there, but I'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And we'll turn, I was going to say too, we should go a little casually. We'll refer to Professor Friedman and everybody else too. We'll go by first name. So Brittany, if you can please talk to us a little bit about the emotions as well as the segue into your research.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for having me. I need to echo Monica. I would say that the amount of people surprised by bigotry in law enforcement has been off-putting, because it is no secret the function of policing is racist at its core and it's objective. And so for me, in reflecting, especially for our discipline, and thinking about these ongoing struggles for freedom, I want us as sociologists to not shy away from intent in our theorizing and in our praxis. And what I mean by this is, as sociologists, we talk a lot about structural racism, we talked about its consequences, but we should also be talking about intent and instrumental violence that serves law enforcement as white supremacy. And for example, I mean, why don't more scholars speak on the racist code in the context of prisons, which is where my research is? The racist code correctional officers follow as social control, right? To sort of, to turn the gaze, to be Foucauldian, turn the gaze, so to speak, right? The racist code that correctional officers weaponize to make sure that prisoners remain divided, for example. What would happen to our theorizing if we looked at the carceral state from this perspective, where intentions are systemic, and they're working at different levels of violence? And so my book research does this by centering prisons in our discussion. And one of the ways I accomplish this in terms of looking at intent is by showing how correctional officers partnered with white supremacist prisoners to target Black freedom fighters because of their political beliefs. And I show that there's various examples of this, and to give a few of them, one would be arming white supremacist prisoners with street knives, right? Well, while Black prisoners are having to makeshift shanks knowing that a hit is coming, or spreading rumors, right? Spreading rumors that Black prisoners are out to get you, to instigate racial animus, right? This is what I mean when I say law enforcement as white supremacy, really focusing on that is intentional, right? It's a hit. In other ways, I also document examples of correctional officers sexually assaulting Black freedom fighters as punishment, as a form of degradation, right? These are political, these constitute, as we talked about, war crimes, right? These are war crimes against Black protest that are arguably easier to carry out within a total institution where the people incarcerated are already relegated to a number. They're already relegated to a number status. And so this is not metaphorical racial violence and racist ideas, but this is instrumental use of violence behind the notion of what Du Bois would say is this white above all, right? Even across status boundaries that we might see, there's a sense of white above all, and no more else than in prison. And that's what I think we really need to grapple with when thinking about how novel is this really.
And you've given me a connection when you talk about intentions. We will get back to that. Intentions as systemic. I want to revisit that, especially in relation to how scholars are talking about racism and policing. In my own case in jailing and policing in Chicago, often the police officers, when arresting Latino defendants, would say, wait till you get to the jail. And they would use Black defendants as scare tactics, saying, there will be Black men who will rape you. And I think we're not talking about that kind of relational violence when we talk about anti-Black racism, and how I think you use the words weaponized. It can be weaponized. So let's come back to all those really great, amazing ideas. Marco, how are you feeling? And tell us a little bit about your work as a scholar activist and the kind of emotions that the current events have brought to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. The first day that I saw the George Floyd video, this was, of course, after Ahmaud Arbery. This was, of course, after Amy Cooper in Central Park. And I came to what I imagined at the moment was a realization of something that I'd never been able to fully admit to, at least to myself. And that was that this country, right, and by this country, like white civil society, legitimately hated Black people. In the words of James Baldwin, these people just cannot possibly think that we're human beings. And I was like, maybe we all made a mistake. Like maybe after the Civil War, we actually should have just got out of here. We should have just left by any means necessary. That's how I felt. Who were we to actually believe that we could exist in this country and make it some notion of a multiracial democracy, I was like, that was a 150-year fool's errand. Maybe we just should have all left. Perhaps it's not too late. How do I get out of here? Like, that's what I felt, right? And then I started seeing the energy in the street. I started checking in with folks around the country. And I was like, all right, the streets was doing what they do when they have to rise up. And that started to invigorate me. That started to like bring back that hope that always moves within me, that like, change can happen, right? Like, because at the end of the day, I'm a hopeless optimistic. I'm like, this, we survived here for like over 400 years. Like this, the Black radical tradition is that we're gonna keep moving, we're gonna keep growing, we're gonna keep progressing. And so that felt good. I started to like get back into the swing of things. I teach Black Studies as a form of political education in the community, and I've been doing that for a long time. And part of my idea, as I say, is to try to create, working with community folks, to create theoretical, solid ground for folks to organize off of as a platform, right? How do we place in historical context this work? And I've seen that is not necessarily the exclusive domain of the academy. You know what I mean? I'm like, so much of my political education came not from a college class, but like a radical reading group that I sat in, right? It came from hours of sitting in organizing meetings, talking to attorney, trying to figure out, how we're gonna do what it is we're trying to do. So that has never felt more real than it does right now in this moment. And we have to begin, and I feel like I'm starting to see this, we have to begin to make systemic changes and practices in the policies and in the ideas that animate our institutions, because that's where this lives. Mm-hmm. That cop that has his knee on George Floyd's neck, you can almost see in his entire, I don't even know what to call it, but like you could just see that like he believed in that. He was like, no, nobody's gonna, I'm untouchable. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you could also hear in the voice of the cloud of witnesses that gather around and they're watching George Floyd and they're recording this. It's like they wanted to do something, but they didn't know what to do. They wanted to, I don't know. I'll stop right there.
No, I think that's profound, and that I think that's why so many of us have felt this way, is that we've gone, I don't know about everybody, but I've gone from the depths of pessimism to the heights of optimism. Marco, I was watching as people were starting the first night of protests, and it was like the president of the NAACP was telling everybody, stop protesting, it's time to wait for your vote. And people were like, are you crazy? Get into the streets, right? I mean, if not now, when, right? How long do we wait? And I think if there's anything that could embody the violence, the cultural violence, of the system of white supremacy and policing, was the posture and stance. I mean, I'm not a performance scholar, but to see him with those pockets, right? The casualness of which death came, and that people on the outside could plead and plead and plead, right? And be scared for their own safety, but plead, and the stance didn't change. I think we have to revisit that too, because I think the officer's stance, read so much to everyone. And I think so many of us have seen an officer take that stance, whether it was for death, but for other posturing in other places, right? Chris, why don't we go to you and tell us about the emotions and take us there, but also to your expertise as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you, Nicole, for having me here. And thanks to my colleagues and everybody who I'm able to share in the space with. I'd like to start with thanking the creator for this opportunity, the Africana spiritual community for looking out for me, and my ancestors for walking with me. More specifically, I would like to call on Marshawn McCarroll, Lucille Clifton, and my aunt Rosalind Graham, my high school football teammate Sean Gamble, and Carter G. Woodson to accompany me in this particular moment. I ask for precision, perspective, humility, and clarity as I begin this engagement of intellectual warfare as an agent of Black liberation and a practitioner of Africana studies. Ashe. All right, so where I'm at, I think in terms of my feeling, I would probably have to say that I'm pretty annoyed in some ways. So I kind of think about situating myself at different times and different locations of struggle, right? So currently for me, a lot of where that struggling is taking place is within sort of the collegiate university context, whether through solidarity with Black and Brown students, organizing and doing work with Black and Brown faculty, and really thinking about what is our relationships to these institutions, which for me are in many ways extensions of the state and extensions of policing, which our communities engage with. So for example, Temple, where I was previously at in Philadelphia, Temple runs one of the largest police forces in North Philadelphia, right? And constantly wields an ability to ensnare folks within the carceral state. So I think that wherever it is that we struggle, we find ourselves in contestation with the state. And I would also say annoyed, before I get into some brief prepared remarks, annoyed because I think that there's this move that I listen to a lot of Big Crit, and Big Crit has this part in Children of the World where he says, they want my soul like my ancestors ain't enough. And I think about that here because it's like, I feel like white folks want everything, right? You want to wield racism and solve racism. You want to do the harm and be the ones to fix it. Like you want every aspect of this, right? To be the worst of the worst while at the same time be the saviors, right? We saw this historically, which for me is where I think a lot with abolition, right? In that like white people wanted it all, right? Wanted to be able to say that white people weren't human. I mean, Black people weren't human or Black people were human, right? Like all of these things. So I'm annoyed with the everything that I feel whiteness wants, even in its like most violent forms. So I guess how that kind of moves me into my work is one of the things that I've been thinking about is like the movement of the word abolition and how it's really come to be more popular. So like at this moment when abolition is a word that in short time has become just as ubiquitous as terms like radical, transformation, and decolonial, is becoming just as imperative that we attune ourselves not only to the meaning of the term, but to the embrace of the term by more and more Black people every day. To those of us who've been engaged in this protracted struggle for at least a decade or more, there are, I'm sure, moments of astonishment when the phrase abolish the police is being uttered in and through the mainstream. Whether folks believe that or not is a whole different thing, but at least that they're saying it is like a trip in some ways. In addition to ensuring that the term retains as much as possible its veracity, we must be mindful of the opportunities and challenges that we have, are, and will continue to emerge from our attempts to practice and embody abolition within our various communities, particularly within a context where abolition is something of which people will now have expectations, something in which people will expect there to be a level of attention to detail, something in which people will expect a level of care, but even more than care, people will expect a certain level of principle. And we must never forget that abolition in the 20th and 21st century, like that iteration, and now like this most current one that we're in, is an invitation for others to trust you. When we say abolish prisons or abolish police, we're asking people to trust us when we say that there is something better on the other side. And not something better for a small segment of the Black population, not something better for race first, cis hetero folks only, but that's better for Black poor people, Black trans people, Black sex workers, Black undocumented folks, and Black people yet to come and yet to conjure themselves in ways that our current vocabulary can't even encapsulate. Every person who embraces abolition as a radical possibility for their own and their descendants' futures is trusting us. My question to us is, what will we do with that trust? So that's kind of where I'm at, is I think that as people kind of like, yo, the abolition thing, I might be with that. I think we have to think, okay, well, then what does that mean for the work that we have to do? Like if the work shifts from, okay, it's simply, y'all, the police are whack. If people are like, I see that, right? Like I have awoken to this. Like I want to think with folks who are like, all right, how do we do the next iteration of this work? And I'm just glad to be here with all of y'all today. Thank you, Nicole, again. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for those opening statements. And I already see themes kind of intertwining. I think this idea of trust, I feel like if we go back in our DeLorean time machine, even just to like 2 months ago, police reformers, you know, the frustration for me was they're calling on more procedure. If only we had procedure. If only we banned chokeholds, there'd be no chokeholds. And then I'm like, well, tell that to Eric Gardner and his family, right? So I guess maybe if some of us can chime in, the logical person to start would be Monica, about, you know, we have trust in law. We have trust in numbers and data, right? We have trust that these instruments are going to help free us from this type of policing. Can you talk to me, especially as a law scholar? I mean, I study lawyers and I study, again, the law, but as a critical lens. And so sometimes the frustration is this trust in procedure can save you. What do we make of that?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things that's really exciting to me right now in terms of how people kind of coming up or doing movement lawyering is critical here, which is to say, lawyering and procedures, et cetera, they're not the answers, but they need to be good, right? Like, so it's like, we need to have good procedures. We need to have processes through which people can have their voices heard. I don't think that like it's bad for police to behave in a procedurally just manner, which is something that I've criticized that as a lens for reform or for transformation or anything like that, because it's not transformative. But so sure, fine, we need to have that. But I think what we've come now is that lawyering and legal processes are not justice. And I think it's really, really important to disentangle what justice looks like from the way lawyers usually behave. Mm-hmm. And so that pushes you, basically that pushes your entire theory of change. And so one of the things I'm excited about, and that's definitely like reflected in a lot of the work I've done and what I want to continue to do, is to continue to disentangle that vision that we can go to court and that justice will be done. Instead, we need to have a framework of justice that is freed from typical constraints, that listens to people's real lived experiences. And I don't know, I guess I'll stop there, but I think there's a lot more to say about that.
Right. And Marco, I think, is there anything that procedure would help communities feel like, can that be some type of remedy? And I think, there is I remember interviewing a defendant, and but right before my book came out, and I actually added him to the book, he said, if you write about this, they're just going to come down upon us with harder justice. And I thought, oh my God, he's using justice as punishment, because in his real life, that the justice system is just synonymous with brutality and corruption and everything. So I guess back at the law professors out there, not specifically Monica, but the totality, can communities ever think of justice as being, or procedure as being, a remedy that would make them feel safe?
Here's what I would say. Oftentimes in these kinds of revolutionary struggles, because that's actually what we're talking about, you have like levels of scaffolding in the kind of work and platforms that you have to lay to create change, right? There have been a number of organizers that have left there and have gone into the legal practice, right? They're going into law school and they study. And so like you need that dimension on the table, right? And that's just been a necessity of like what it's meant to be Black in America, right? Like you gotta have this, you gotta have that. Like, is voting gonna save it? No, we gotta vote strategically here, and we gotta think about that. But yet at the same time, that can't be, and this is, and I think this is a key point in here. We can't imagine that freedom, that liberation comes from that work. That's a tool and that's a necessary thing to do. But the theorizing about how we get free actually has to come from some other place, right? We do what we need to do to survive, just to get along. You understand what I'm saying? Listen, mama who's working in the white lady's kitchen, she's always gonna steal some food from the kitchen and bring back to the house and feed you. That's what was expected. But at no point in time is she imagining that practice is actually the practice of liberation, like we're just trying to survive. The actual practice is how do we imagine. This is a beautiful moment for us to imagine a different world.
Mm-hmm.
When are the last times that we remember something like this? We think maybe like the last instantiation of the civil rights movement, modern era, right? When the country has to radically reimagine what life is going to be like for Black Americans who don't live under the confines of a Jim Crow system. Because for white civil society, that's where was Black folks' place.
Mm-hmm.
Black folks started busting out of that. Not just in terms of legal policy, but where else did we see Black folks breaking those confines? Music, Motown. That's what Motown was. Finding ways to break outside of these confines. But then if we jump back, what's the time to remember before that? Literally, we have to literally go back to the Civil War, when the nation is grappling with the concept of what does it mean to have these Negroes who used to be our private property, now moving about in space, not as private property. And so part of my response to that is those moments call upon a radical reimagination of how society is going to function. And that's the place that we're talking about right there. I mean, I'll come back to like, you know, my brother, Chris Roberts, like it's like, it's not that we say abolition, but how do we now have a critical conversation about what does that actually mean?
Right.
That's everybody can spell it, but now it's, okay, let's create, oh, you say abolition? Okay, here we go. Y'all didn't really mean that. I thought y'all meant, the last time we said abolition, it mean we had the nation fought a war over that. It was a civil war. And so we have a moment where we can create right now. I think that's a beautiful thing, but we gotta have some intellectually honest conversations.
Right. And I think that I want to talk to Chris because the topics are so, your idea about the trust and defining and definition. I have to admit that even though I was, someone who studied racism in the system at a time where people told me, there's no racism, how will you measure racism? And I was like, what? Like just walk into the court and they're almost, people are in open court abusing people or using slurs, or it was so obvious to me. But I have to admit, even though I had read Angela Davis, I could not imagine, like I didn't have the scripts in my brain to imagine a world where there wasn't police forces locking down community. I have to say that. How do we get to this idea of this radical imagination when yet all we've known, right? And as a cultural sociologist, I mean, many cultural sociologists would predict that doesn't exist. If you don't have frameworks, cognitive frameworks in your head to then start imagining, how do we get to that place to so clearly articulate abolition? But then how do you make sure it's not co-opted by the policing scholars that were so vested in the same system and actually taking money to make it look exactly the same?
Thank you for that question, Nicole. I think that's really one of the major questions that we have right now, because in one way, for me, part of what we have to think about is there will be attempts at co-optation. The question is rather like, what do we do about that? So I guess really for me, it's important maybe to give some background context. I've kind of arrived at this position through like really working hard at reform, to be honest with you. I think when I was younger, I was part of an organization called Justice for DC Youth, where we would go into, the facility no longer exists. It was called Oak Hill, but now it's New Beginnings. This is in DC. Pretty much 100% Black and brown, folks who were under 18 were incarcerated there, and we would do literacy programs with them all the time. Shout out to Shawnee O'Neal, who ran that program. After which I was doing work with Joanna McCants through a program in DC called Visions to Peace. And we were doing work, this is back like maybe 2010, 2011, around thinking about like creating different pathways for folks to envision peace and justice in their communities. And for me, it started it wasn't even early, it was work that was more about meeting folks in community where they were. And that was where I began to see, like we can solve conflict differently. we can deal with harm differently. And, oh, we might not have to call the police for this. We can just kind of settle this amongst ourselves. And that ultimately led to me doing work in Oakland Freedom Schools and with BYP 100, really thinking through what healing and safety means, like through a community of Black folks committed to freedom collectively. So for me, it's been a long journey, but I think I was brought up someone really invested in electoral politics, really invested in like what they could do. And I think I saw those systems break my heart time and time and time again. I think for me, it was trying, and this is sort of what I think about policing, right? Is that James Baldwin has this Fifth Avenue Uptown essay where he talks about, like, despite the policeman's best intentions, like they are going to be nothing but what they are in the communities. Like he says, you can give like gumdrops and like candy to children all day, it doesn't matter. And I think that for me, one part of my journey has really been that it doesn't matter about your intentions. Like you can be the best intentioned whoever. You can think you're going to be a police officer who changes the whole thing. You can think you're going to be, like it's kind of, for me, it was about moving away from ego. They got me to abolition because I feel like there's a lot of ego in thinking that I'm going to go in and totally up in this with like, there've been a lot of folks really dedicated to this reform thing. And we still are where we are. So that for me has been the journey, was that really taking seriously folks who've like dedicated their lives to changing these things from within and seeing how entrenched these systems are. So for me, it's actually been about moving away from an ego that thinks I can go in and do something, and really thinking of abolition as a collective project that is much more about us working together, because it's not about, because no one person is going to go in and either create the new thing or take apart the old thing. Like we all need each other. So
yeah, thank you. Brittany, I want to turn back to your really provocative and important statements about academics kind of failing to interrogate the notion of intention, and this idea of their intentions in the system. So I as a race scholar, I've been kind of have a major pet peeve when people talk about structural racism and when people talk about implicit racism. It in some ways absolves white people, police officers in particular, of their overt violence, right? That it actually took real actors practicing culturally in real settings with real people to inflict this level of violence, right? So if you say what created George Floyd was systemic, it meant, it's kind of not within him, right? If you say it's implicit bias, it's unconscious. And I'm like, no, what killed Mr. George Floyd was a type of conscious and violent racism that can be practiced and learned and passed down through generations of people. And so if you could take us a little bit into the prison system, because there's such a link. And I think maybe start a little bit with how policing is linked to the law enforcement within jails, and then talk about that intentionality. What's the right type of racism to use? Structural, implicit, overt? What do you use in your research, and tell us why?
So I think I will start by sort of building also off of what Christopher was saying about the posture and stance, right, of Chauvin when he killed George Floyd, right? And so Nicole, like as you often say, cultures of violence in the courts and jails are an open secret, and that's the position, right, that we see him taking even with a smirk, because I believe you can see a smirk in the video of the murder, and this sort of reminds me of what other open secrets do we have amongst professionals who work in corrections and also study corrections? And so an example I can think of is presenting at an academic conference where I'm talking about intent, I'm using examples of how correctional officers are combining legal controls like solitary confinement with what we would consider extra legal control strategies like assaults or hits to control incarcerated people, and particularly targeting people who have been identified as being a political threat, particularly a Black political threat. And a person at the end of the conference comes up to me who is affiliated, announces that they're affiliated with the Corrections Association, and says, off the record, yes, that does happen in the contemporary, because I'm talking about it historically in my work, but he said in the contemporary, when officers feel it's easier, more effective to remove someone from the population. And so when I think about abolition, I think about this. I mean, how will bias training fix an open secret? How will bias training fix the fact that, that officers, I mean, you could argue officers, to go back to the posturing, right? Officers at all levels of the security apparatus, we can look at all the levels, from police to corrections to border patrol. They take this godlike stance in their weaponization of racial violence that's so brazen, to where is even the secret, right, for the survivors? Right. And so when I'm talking about intentions that are systemic, I think we should be moving in a direction where we look at your work and combining it with the work of Jeff Ward when he's talking about the organized nature, right? Mm-hmm. But also looking at the fact that I had great conversations with a colleague of mine, Teresa Beardall. We were talking about how the system has the ability, it's not just slow violence when we're talking about intent. The system has the ability to act quickly, and we see it. There's moments where there's an opening and a reason to act quickly in its violence. So I think incorporating the levels, but also sort of teasing out, what do we mean by slow violence that is intentional, but what do we also mean when the violence is, there's something temporal that the system can act in really by any means necessary, not to perverse that, but that is the case. That is what I would argue, that the stance that officers take when they're trying to eradicate either something, or Ruth Gilmore calls it, right, a surplus, Black surplus. How do we think about that when we're talking about intent within prisons, in particular in corrections? Because I would argue that the mass incarceration in terms of organizing this surplus, right? I think we have to think about that in terms of what happens within the institutions once people get there. What are the people to then, quote, organize, but I use the word annihilate, because that's what my data shows. It's to completely annihilate not only the body, but the spirit, is what I would argue.
Right. And I think it's important, in terms of talking about the words that we choose, and again, like, I think it's very telling to me that something like implicit bias, work that talked about, I think of the case of Philando Castile, that second shot, that second reaction, the split second reaction, that the officer made, right, where he thinks that it's a gun, and I think Philando Castile's pulling his wallet out of the glove compartment. That could have a legitimate place within criminal justice research, legal research, but yet it's become the word that we use now when we don't want to say racism, right? Or scholars for years says, I'm a scholar of race. When they really, I used to wonder, well, do you study racism? I mean, tell me more, right? So I think, academics, we have a role in this. Monica, if you could talk a little bit about that too. I mean, I was thinking when Brittany was talking about police unions, one of the major things that I've seen beyond, the kind of, they've often stood against reform at all costs, transparency at all costs. So we get back to this kind of dirty open secret. Many of them will resist police records and people that have been reprimanded numerous times of the records of those to be open. Can you talk a little bit about the role of police unions and the legal, I would say the legal actors that protect police officers? Because there's an entire force of attorneys that they've gone to law school. There are, in some ways, they make commitments like any lawyers, I would think, in their ethics, and yet their job is largely to produce positive outcomes for police unions and officers that inflict violence. So can you tell us a little bit about that and the role of the lawyers in this all?
Sure, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I mean, so one thing to keep in mind, I mean, it's kind of like a strange feature of this conversation, or these conversations about police unions, because theoretically, we want workers to organize, right? I mean, theoretically, we want there to be some sort of voice for kind of frontline workers, which theoretically police unions are supposed to be. But the problem is, because of the toxicity of police culture and because of the particular functions of policing, even this thing that we might want to support theoretically, the union, is tainted and becomes a device for protecting violent, protecting individual violent police officers and trying to shield information. I think there are a couple of different pieces of this from a legal perspective that are really important. One that has been talked about ad nauseum, I would say too much, is qualified immunity. So essentially, you know, if a police officer violates someone's constitutional rights, then there's currently right now a semi, like an interpretation of constitutional doctrine that allows them to escape accountability for that in a legal context. And there is, kind of as Nicole's talking about, an architecture of lawyers that are engaged in perpetuating that idea, but critically, and this is really, really important. I think most of the police, prosecutors, private defenders of police union workers, et cetera, see themselves as engaged in a sort of neutral activity. Mm-hmm. They don't see themselves as engaged in a racist activity. They think, well, look, the officer may have actually feared for, you know, his, her, or their life. And so the constitutional doctrine is clear. This is reason, you know, there's reasonability here. They sort of cling to the letter of the law and precedent over really taking account of the sociological reality of racism in policing. And so I think there's this way in which both police unions and also lawyers are engaged in this kind of maintenance of the status quo. And so it allows people to escape individual accountability for their role in perpetuating these institutions. So that, I think, is a really, really deep conversation within the legal profession that has to be had, reckoning with the divide between what lawyers typically do, which is maintain and focus on the rule of law, and the concept of justice, of racial equity, et cetera, that we're starting to have now. So my hope is that we will be able to infuse these things more deeply into the ethos of policing, not of policing, but of lawyering, and also in ways that would influence the kind of perpetuation of police unions. I have one other quick thing I want to say, which is that we also need to be looking at state law and state legislature action. So police unions are often treated in a preferential way. And as to say, also police kind of fraternal organizations, not all of them are technically unions. But there's a way in which states treat them preferentially, give them extra voice, give them additional lobbying power, build in their existence into, so I'm thinking about Maryland, the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. This is also something people need to be made aware of. In addition to lawyers, there's also legislation that needs to be unwound in order to change some of the conversation we're having from a workers' rights scenario.
Can I ask one follow-up on this? Because, as one thing that is close to my heart and is interrogating prosecutors' role in all of this. It was quite telling. I worked on an article with Samil Trivedi. He's an ACLU attorney, and we study the kind of national, how prosecutors from a national standpoint have largely covered up for police by never charging them, right? For a bunch of different reasons, but we go through institutions, and we were at a Boston University law symposium, and a scholar pushed back on me and says that the dynamics that I witnessed in Chicago, that I had data on about police perjury, it's systemic prevalence in the court system, where prosecutors were covering up for police officers and doctoring cases, that was just a Chicago only. And I said, show me a jurisdiction where officers are getting charged. Show me that jurisdiction, and that will be our best practice model. I guess the question of frustration is, where are the ethics charges for these types of prosecutors? When do they get held accountable? I mean, I'm thinking about Connick versus Thompson, and you know, where Harry Connick Sr. has a team of prosecutors and they're hiding evidence and people are going to jail for 30 years wrongfully convicted, and yet Harry Connick Sr. can just continue to be a prosecutor after acting in that way. Where is the Bar Association? Where's the ethics? Oh, and how can we in some ways hold the Bar Associations accountable for them looking the other way when prosecutors act more like I don't know, the henchmen for the police?
Yeah. So really quickly on that, I mean that is so important. And I
Can you tell I'm a little angry at that part?
Well, I would also, of course, take issue with that.
I take issue.
This is like just a Chicago sort of story. In terms of accountability, when I think about the major vector of accountability for prosecutors, sure, I think the bar associations can play a role. The problem is the public, right? The problem is many prosecutors are elected, and what gets people excited is letting police officers go for when they violate people's rights, because there's this public idea that the police are associated with public safety, and of course prosecuting marginalized people for similar sorts of acts and the entire charging structure. So we have to keep in mind that like political story, which is that it's really hard to make change in the prosecutor's office without there being some kind of more public reckoning. So one thing that's really exciting to me is that I think we've started to ask questions. There started to be some change in what the whole, and people can have lots of valid criticisms of progressive prosecutors, but there is a conversation, at least, that prosecutors have been a big part of the problem, and that even many powerful prosecutors are saying we have been part of the problem. So I think that's like a positive step in terms of like a narrative shift, even if it's not the big change we want to see. But yeah, in terms of the bar associations, I think there could be a lot more shaming done there, of course, but yeah, I think we need bigger change than that.
Yes. Well, okay. So here, just to take a quick announcement here, we want to get to as many questions as possible. So I said we have like 700 people tuning in right now, and I just want to thank all of them for sticking with us and being engaged. We're already seeing some people kind of chime in with questions. So I think what we're going to do is I have one more question that I want everybody to kind of tackle. And then we have a wonderful facilitator, Catherine Van Amber, you're going to hear her voice, and she'll kind of help me filter all these questions and pick some of them. Some of them already came in with the registration, and we're going to start doing that very shortly. But I wanted to end with one more, and not just end the piece, but I wanted one more question from all of you, is tell me about what reparations looks like to you. And I think, and I mean reparations in a lot of different ways. Professor Marcus Hunter at UCLA talked about academic reparations. Think about what happened to Du Bois, right? Never getting acknowledged by the University of Pennsylvania for the work that he did and the accomplishments he made, and how many white scholars had pushed him out and vilified him or marginalized him. And I know so many scholars who have done work in this area have also had the same fate. But I think reparations, it can mean things like money, it can mean things like research, it can mean things like what? And I wanted to kind of go through the panel, and maybe why don't we start with Marco and tell me what would reparations look like to you for this system?
Well, this is we can have a whole panel.
We should do a part 2 just on that.
Part 2 just on this. So the first thing that I will start out my response by saying this. One thing I think reparations looks like is a literal undoing of the structures that have been put in place by white supremacy to maintain what we see now. So the first thing I'm going to say is, free every political prisoner who is still alive and in prison, free them, complete commuting of sentences, and set up a financial fund to take care of them and their family for the rest of their lives. A radical retransformation of the public education system in the country, so that these fundings that we're talking about, when we say defund the police, have a direct pipeline rerouting that into those structures. I also imagine reparations looking like colleges and universities opening up specific targeted scholarships, fully funded, for folks in the Black community, not unlike what they do through a sort of like clandestine pipeline for elite folks, but something like very intentional. I think that where reparations gets weedy and muddy is when we try to do this really like fine tune, like, okay, well this, but not that, well who's gonna actually pay and this and that. For me, what's functional now is to just like make like a broad set of, I mean, look at Black Panther's 10-point program. Like that, we could pull out stuff, literally lift right out of the Black Panther 10-point plan and be like, all right, put an R by reparations, yep, reparations right there, and move that way. That's always been a very useful way for me to start to think about that conversation.
Chris, what are you thinking reparations would look like?
I guess it's a multi-layered question. I guess as someone who's committed to abolition, I don't think much is possible in the current system. So for me, I will say though, thinking about the efforts of folks like in Cobra and CARICOM, I think about the question in two ways. I guess what Alexis Pauline Gumbs calls it the end of the world. I think there's before the end of the world abolition, like reparations, and after the end of the world. Like those are two different things. So before this whole thing is gone, and it should be gone, before that happens, I do think that for me, this is, if in a monetary sense, anything that is not empires wholesale defunding themselves into insolvency, I think is a start. I think that the United States would have to defund itself to the position of insolvency for me to take anything like reparations seriously. I think that it is not, because I'm thinking with like City of Hartman and Stefan Vest, like there's no justice in this thing. Like justice is not there for us. Like we're always on the run and always forced to run. We're always moving and always having to move. Like I think for me, looking at the long history of reparations efforts in this country, I think that yes, sort of access to institutions, sort of transforming the material conditions of folks. I think those are things for me. Okay, like immediate addressing of material conditions such as homelessness, or houselessness, such as people who don't have access to health, like all those things. But those aren't, to me, that doesn't meet the bar. But that's the baseline of like, that's when these white folks talking about like, oh, I want to be an anti-racist today. Like that's just the start for me. Like there shouldn't be folks out on the street, period. There's like, this system should not exist. So I don't want to talk too long, but the point for me is that ultimately, and we haven't even got to Native American folks, and like that all of this is happening on stolen land, like, and that, so for me, it's like reparations on an abolitionist trajectory. I think everything that like Marco stated, for me, like that's what we come into the table with. Like that's what we're coming to the table with, like as a baseline. Like give me the 10-year plan for police to be gone. Give me the 10-year plan for this thing to no longer exist. Like it's, like, I think you were asking in the beginning, like, how are we feeling? Like, I'm tired of trying to make a thing work that will not work for us. I would very much like to invest my energy into what I said before about creating these sort of radical imaginings of futures, so that when people trust us, when we say, hey, yo, hop on this abolition wave, I want to be able to put my time there to be like, yo, like we spent years and years and years thinking about what care, justice, and accountability could look like outside of these legal systems. You know, like that's where I want to put my time, is like crafting those alternative things. So I'm gonna stop there, but I think where Marco said, like, that's where we start. But ultimately, these places have to defund themselves into insolvency. That's reparations for me.
Thank you. And Brittany, what do you think? I guess I was thinking as well as, you know, all the data in your book of all the people brutalized by the prison system. I don't, you know, it's hard to even quantify how you give people their life back, take away their trauma, take away what's been denied, their dignity. From your vantage point, looking at law enforcement as it extends into the prison, what would reparations look like?
So I would contextualize that within some of the points that Christopher raised in terms of defunding. So one of the things that the question had me thinking about is, what if we turned our reparations gaze onto the funding agencies? What about the funding agencies that have harmed our communities, that have harmed the survivors that I've spoken to, by transforming tools of torture like solitary confinement, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if we shift those funds? For example, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about all of the research that has tried to transform various types of control techniques that are not just torture somewhere out there, but they're torture here at home in the US. And so I think when we're talking about reparations, an avenue that I frequently think of too is sort of this academic reparations, but turning it to the funding, the source of funding that is expanding the carceral state through this production of knowledge. And we like to say that, for example, scholars like myself and your work and Monica's work and Marco's work and Christopher's work, right? People like to say, oh, that's political. But isn't it racist to say that's political if all of your work is done on behalf of the state to expand the carceral state, right?
Bingo. I was thinking that. Well, I mean, how about this? We call scholars who study how the state inflicts violence, you know, some people would say you're an activist to demean you. And I'm thinking, what does it mean if you take a grant from the police themselves and then do research alongside the police as a partner? Where is the appendix to your research to show your impartiality when you've both taken money and, I don't know, wouldn't there be repercussions if you said something negative about the people you study? Wouldn't they throw you out? I mean, to me, that this is, I think, Brittany, you're hitting on a larger point about academic complicity, how, you know, when you said the funding should shift to these agencies, I was thinking, you know, in some cases, there are like scholars that do predictive crime science policing where they're swarming neighborhoods, and yet they're trying to apply for body cam research, was supposed to be the remedy for accountability. It was supposed to be an accountability measure, and it's the same people that taking the money. So how do we, I guess, you know, before we move to Monica, how do we get the receipts like that you are actually a person that should be funded, right? When so many people are taking money but have done really harmful things.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. And that's why when I think about reparations, I that we also have to think of and reparations as shifting funds toward abolitionist visions. I think we have to think about the production of knowledge as being complicit. When we're thinking about defunding the police, we also have to think about the knowledge that is produced to expand the police, and think about how that knowledge has been wielded to create incredible intergenerational harm. So I think that abolition is, I know the phrase abolition is a presence, but it's a presence across. You can't be for one system, abolishing one system of oppression and not looking at all. That's what abolition is thinking broadly about oppression and thinking about it, as Angela Davis says, as the intersection of struggles, right? It's the intersection of struggles, and so when you were bringing it up for me, it was immediately, I'm thinking about all of the people that I have interviewed that have spent decades in solitary confinement as a result of knowledge used to justify them being there. I think we have to think about reparations broadly in that sense and linking it to knowledge that is justifying these systems of harm.
Yes. And Monica, if you can give us your sense of what reparations might look like.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I guess I'm stuck a little bit on this idea that kind of like, where does reparations fit into a broader struggle for abolition, for transformation, for whatever it is, for something that justice looks like? And so for me, I think one point I want to raise is, to me, the dialogue about reparations is really key for understanding how history links itself to the present. But one thing I want to be clear about is that the history that we're talking about, apropos of the conversation we started to have about colonialism, is not just one of slavery. So when I think about the value of a reparations conversation, it's reparations for all of it. It's micro and macro. It's much bigger. And I think in order to actually have something that we can really have this tractable, tangible, and practical around reparations, we have to start thinking about kind of really micro level. So one idea I've had recently, for example, is all of these incidents in which white people call the police on Black people or brown people for just like being in space. One approach is the one we've had, which is like shaming sanctions, which, you know, I'm not really hating on that, but I don't think internet justice is justice. Another kind of thing that people have thrown around is, oh, why don't we kind of prosecute these people? I take umbrage to that sort of approach to justice. Doesn't do anything for us. Like, that doesn't do anything for marginalized people who experience these calls. And so one like really granular thing that communities could do is to put together like a racism response fund, where it's like, okay, you've faced a racist incident. Here is like money, and here are also resources to deal with the trauma that comes from that. And that's really, really micro, and it's very practical, but what it does is shift the conversation to one about repair and restoration, and away from just like, I don't know, shaming racists. And so that, I guess, as much as I want to be an analyst, I want to be a theorist, I think about my family, I think about like people who are harmed every day, who don't have resources because we haven't had we haven't done serious granular work. I mean, people have done, but I mean like on a policy level around reparations that is comprehensive. And so I actually do want to be granular in the status quo about giving people resources and access to meaningful change. One other just very quick final point that we haven't raised yet. I think the academic reparations thing is key, and I also even would say that runs toward who we cite. So that's a big part of it. But also this whole issue we're having around Confederate monuments and stuff. And maybe I care about this especially because I'm from South Carolina. And it's like, and I grew up with this like specter of all these things. It's like, no, I want to see monuments to my ancestors. I want to see, and here, and why that matters, one of the ways that matters is because it gives us new ways of thinking about power. It's like, who owns this space? Who is this for? That shift in ideology is tied to these ways we memorialize. And so for my vision of something called reparations would certainly include those two.
And I think that's important too, because it leads to, the notion of education. In Chicago, there was a torture ring. John Burge tortured over 120 African-American men into false confessions. It reads like war crimes. He was never charged for those violent crimes and was ultimately charged with a type of perjury. But one of the victims of that torture ring, of that injustice, received I would say a large settlement that was divided amongst so many victims. But one of the things I think that was most protested by policing families was the requirement of the Chicago Public Schools to teach that history. And I think that shows that, white supremacy relies on covering up, right, the violence. And I would like to get to a point that AP US history, if you're going to take AP US history, you should understand the history of lynching in America. And you should be able to understand how it worked, and that people took pictures and sent postcards and posed with Black victims and how it terrorized people. We should know about that white criminality. And I think even saying the notion white criminality, we have not really said that, right? So I think the education does matter, because then by the time that child then grows up to be a free thinking person, going to college, getting a job, they will feel very differently about a lot of policy decisions and how they vote. So to me, that's a really important thing, and maybe important instruction from Chicago and in this kind of one victory that was won. So I want to go to Catherine, who's going to moderate some of our questions. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, and we've been getting some really wonderful questions from the audience. I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but the first question comes from Daria, and they're asking about the political economy of policing, how white capital depends on law and policing to prop up racial capitalism, and how do we think about reform and radicalism in the shadow of capitalism?
Wow, who can take that one?
I mean, I could, oh, go ahead, Monica.
Thank you, Chris.
No, please go ahead, Chris.
Okay, no, I just quickly was gonna say thank you first off for the question, and what I would sort of say or think about it, and maybe kind of bringing my own thinking into it. Since you were just talking about monuments, Monica, like that actually brings me to a lot of the work that I do around public memory and memorialization. And I think that we have to understand like memory as a particular type of social capital as well. And that for me, I guess like what I would want to think about relative to policing is like the protection of monuments that we've seen recently, like that we've seen police really deployed to protect monuments. And I think about this in many ways as like the police being drawn out and physically surrounding the statues, often in circular motions or otherwise like these geometric formations, where the state is literally acting as like the compass, and it's like drawing the police in a sort of thin blue line, right? To sort of go with the theme of the talk today, like around the monuments in order to protect them, right? To really ensure the preservation of like the facts, supposedly, of empire, right? Because when people question monuments, they begin to question facts, because monuments are set in stone. So how does all this get us to this idea of like racial capitalism? So for me, it's that I think once we begin to really see like, what is it, this is sort of a bit like, what is it that the police really protect? And that's sort of a base question, right? And I have sort of like early conversations with folks about abolition, like, it's like, what do the police protect? And more often than not, most of what they protect is stuff, right? They protect things, they protect money, right? And also to go back to the idea of law, like what is the law to those who are already always objectified, i.e. Black folks, right? When you're not, you don't have access to these categories of like human and person in the same way that others do. So when I think about like how this informs our analysis, I think that we have to begin to frame discussions for people around the police relative to a lot of the work that's happened on the ground around like 8 to Abolition, which came out in response to the more reformist like measure that was out before, right? So that would be my response. Is I think that for me, we have to think about what is it that the police ultimately protect, and what ways can we begin to move folks to understanding that that protection is not for you, but it is against you, right? It is in fact to be wielded against you. There is nothing in the function of policing, like structurally, right, that is like, well, who gets protection? So I think really opening up these conversations around protection for folks, and I think the monuments, as Monica brought up, open up an opportunity. It's like, wow, I've never seen police in a community like that before, some may say, right? Or I've never seen police protect like the home of a domestic violence survivor I know like that. Or I've never seen police protect a sex worker who was assaulted like that, but they're protecting this random statue. Like that's where I think we can begin these conversations.
Right. Thank you. Catherine, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. The question is asking the panelists thoughts on law enforcement coming from the communities where they work, or being mandated to be on a community policing team that allows them to become invested in the communities socially, and is that an appropriate response to the situation we're in now?
So I'll just talk briefly about that. And I actually want to start with what Monica and Brittany sort of left us with in their remarks. This idea of police culture. It does not matter if the individual police officer, I don't care if he coaches Little League basketball and he's a church pastor. Like, that's irrelevant. How do we think about police culture? And Monica connects that to essentially 3 things. She says the state, That's electoral politics. They're involved in creating these laws and setting these policies. Then we have the legal system, teams of lawyers who manage this. When we put these things together in a constellation, that's a system at work. And that system, coming to Brittany, then gets informed and reinvigorated. Essentially, it continues to procreate itself through a particular line of knowledge, a particular line of thinking. And we can't be intellectually lazy in this moment. Part of the work we have to do is we have to like think ourselves through something. See, if this was like, I don't know, 1799 and we're in Haiti, folks would just get the sugarcane knives out and we're in the midst of a battle. But that's not the moment that we're in. So how do we understand the particular context of the moment that we're in? If we are to be, again, intellectually honest, there's officers and folks in law enforcement. All of us got a cousin who knows somebody that like works in some area of law enforcement. And we have very amicable relations with this individual. But at no point in time do we lose track of like when they don that uniform, what they're representing. That's what we're trying to speak to. And and those kind of moves are like a default sentiment. Yeah, but that's nice. That's just not what we're talking about. I don't know. I hope that makes sense.
I think it does, Marco. I think it goes back to what Brittany, we had mentioned, the dirty open secret, which is, you know, why don't we see more officers whistleblowing, right? So if there's this notion of dichotomy of the good cops versus the bad cops, where are the good cops whistleblowing right now? Where are they? I like to see them because I know they exist, but the issue is when you talk about the culture being more important than the individual, they cannot step forward. I would say many of them don't step forward out of absolute fear. And that should tell us the violence. If the supposed good cops are scared of their brothers in blue, now we are appropriately talking about the level of violence and racism. You know, there was a protest in Chicago where Black retired officers were taking a knee outside of the FOP. They had no white officers next to them. They were not in the picture. And so again, you know, I challenge this idea about, you know, to your skepticism, I absolutely think that's true. Is it a culture is bigger than the individual? And this is not about nice. This is about racism, or this is about a violent culture that's bigger than one good, quote, good officer. One good officer. Catherine, is there more questions?
Yes, there are. This question comes from Stanley, and Stanley says, I'd love to ask the panel their thoughts about the extent to which and the ways in which the law can be considered a resource for Black people, especially in the context of extralegal police killings that are justified by the prediction of action in the future, by feelings and by racism, legitimating violence in the present tense, you know, the quote, I feared for my safety, etc. If these killings can be legal, but we nevertheless need the law, how can we think about the law in relation to Blackness in the US?
Ooh, I feel like, Monica, you have to take that question, please.
Sure.
Let's think through it.
Sure. I'll say, well, one thing that's really important is to not have this in our heads, this idea of there's the law. The law is actually extremely complicated, and there are aspects of the law that can be helpful, and then there are many aspects of the law as a status quo orientation system that are of course deeply dehumanizing. And so there's this way in which we have conversations about policing and zoom in on kind of the reasonableness of police killings as being the lawfulness of police killings as being the law in the situation. But when I think about the law and what kind of the possibilities we could have, I think about, you know, the 13th Amendment, for example. I think, why don't we kind of reinterpret this idea of like kind of moving beyond the badges and incidents of slavery and tearing those out as being something that's in the law too. So one thing I think is really important, as I was saying earlier, law isn't leading this movement. We are not in like a civil rights era framework in which there can be some concept that if we only win the right court cases, then we will have achieved justice. That's wrong. But there are so many ways in which aspects of the law can be adopted as language to help us push forward in ways that could ultimately be liberatory. So thinking about law more as a horizon than a set of tactics in the status quo, I think is key. And then there are, and so I think that's one piece of things. It's just not to say, oh, because certain acts, basically because the law legitimates a certain amount of evil, then there's nothing in the law for anyone. And I would also urge us to look more locally as well. So not just to think about federal law, but also to be thinking about state law and local ordinances. And if we look at Minneapolis and the move to defund, I mean, these actions are creating law as well. And so I'm having much more of a power position and a power orientation toward capabilities in the law is going to be key for moving us toward a world in which Fourth Amendment reasonableness is not our vision of what justice and lawfulness looks like.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any more, Catherine? I think we have time for at least one more.
All right, if we only have time for one more, the one I'd like to end on is hearing the panelists' thoughts on what a post-abolition world could look like.
So maybe let's start with, do you want to start with Brittany?
So when I think about what a post-abolition world would look like, one of the things that I zero in on, and this is because much of my work is looking at the atrocities of the police, right? What I think about is all of the ways that communities have been handling disputes without this violent state intervention, right? And I also think about all of the ways that are possible where people could live and exist without the sense of fear, sort of clouding over. I talk about this a lot in my work as a sense of darkness, as law enforcement, as death work, where there's this darkness that is encompassing. People feel it as encompassing. And this is like using people's own words. And so when I think about an abolitionist vision, I think about it, and I'm using metaphors, but that's because I'm trying to draw from people's voices of there's a light in terms of how the community thrives, right? That's how I think about it. And I really, I look to, and thinking about the how this is operationalized, to the longstanding work of scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right? Of Micah Hershend, his work, right? I think about all of these visions for how we can thrive without this sense of fear covered in silence. And I know that's very poetic, and people would criticize it as such, but that's really where I start. I start big in terms of the dreaming before getting down to protocols as such that people might better grapple with.
Great, thank you. And how about Chris? Can you talk us through?
Yeah, I have a ton of thoughts, but I guess like in the time we have left, just to quickly say, I think one is, I really want to come back. I guess what I was thinking about in advance of this talk today is really this idea of like abolition as an invitation to trust. And I think that for me, if we were to think about a quote post-abolitionist future, I think it's a world where we're able to begin like trusting and caring for each other, right? Because in many ways, like we retreat to policing, or we retreat to like elected officials in many ways, because we live in a society, speaking of racial capitalism, like capitalism is built off of ensuring that we don't really have a collective of people to trust, but rather a collective of institutions, right? Like you trust police, you trust government, you trust media, like we trust things and institutions. And I am more interested in a world where we can trust people and trust each other and be trustworthy. So that requires for me an entirely different way of being, in relation to one another, an entirely different way of, and I come to this through thinking about things like conflict resolution, like addressing harm, right? We often, I've done a lot of work around conflict resolution and like circle practices and mediation. And oftentimes what we find is that it's like, we might agree with each other politically, but we just don't trust each other, right? Like a lot of folks can agree politically, but like, do you trust and care for one another? So I think it starts there, is like, do we move with integrity? Do we move with principle? Like, because I think if we have those things, we can weather everything else. If we don't have trust, care, and, you know, love for one another, then I don't know what, you know, I don't really know what we can do, because like the state is always going to be ready to respond. I think that's the other thing, is that like, yeah, so it's just trust. I think that trust is really going to be at the center of a lot of it. And that's not perfection. That's not idealism. That's not that everything's perfect. Like, we will harm each other. We will still hurt each other. But if the trust is underneath all of that, if we trust each other to just do better next time and earn that trust. Yeah, that's mine.
Thank you so much. Marco, you want to take us? Okay.
No, I was gonna say, it looks like Wakanda, Black Panther. We just need some vibranium and then we can build it. Find some vibranium somewhere. You know, we don't know, because we have to create it. We have to, like, this is the lab, right? We got to get in there and imagine it. And so we got to have that love and that trust. I think part of what it looks like, we have to ask our children. Like, I think they know, right? And we also got to ask our elders, right? Because they've been looking at this for a long time. We got to ask our scholars and our scientists to, like, crunch some data and process some information. We got to ask our artists, those who create, to help us paint another picture. I believe this is a beautiful moment. This is not, yeah, we don't know, because we have to build it, and everything is available to us. If we work on that love, if we work on that courage, if we work on that trust, because we haven't seen it. And Black people have been trying to do this again for over 400 years, and we're at a particular moment. So it's an invitation. It's an invitation to imagine, to dream, to be transparent. It's an invitation to say you don't know, to say you're not sure. I mean, you know, we're scholars on here, we're talking about these things, and sometimes I think, you know, the larger public lose track of the fact that, like, I don't know, we don't know. We talk to people, and we read books, and we study stuff, and we sit in conversation, and, like, I don't know, we're trying to figure this out. You know, my grandmother was a farmer, and she would plant some seeds in the ground. And then you try to ask her what's going to happen when the harvest comes up. And she said, well, we're going to find out. We're going to water it, and we're going to tend to it, and we're going to process it, and then we'll see what comes up. Mm-hmm. So, but she had to put in that labor and do that work.
Yeah.
And so that would be my response to that.
Thank you so much. And Monica, if you could tell us what the future would look like.
Yeah, I'm going to be really brief, in part because I think probably my response is sort of annoying, which is that I don't think we know what a post-abolition world should look like, and that's and so in that conversation about kind of there getting from here to there, we need things that might be kind of less inspiring to think about, like research on the alternative systems that people are trying to develop. We need to think about ways to build collective efficacy and power within communities more so that it's not just kind of communities that already have kind of community organizations and things to kind of help these processes along, to be able to make this kind of scalable, to make alternatives scalable. And then the last thing I want to say is that it is a bit unclear in conversations about abolition, what people's views are on the state. And I just want to say, from my vantage point, is that for me, the ideal has to be a state that works. That doesn't mean a policing and prison system that works as it is or anything like that. But I think that would be a grave injustice if the answer was just, oh, we do everything ourselves, given that we live in a complex, multifaceted society that is going to have a government of some type. And that should work for all of us. So that's my positionality, but I don't think that's really, I don't think we know what a post-abolition world looks like.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I want to express my thanks to this amazing panel of experts and activists and scholars. We want to thank the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, in particular, Barrymore Bogues, who's convening us, and his tireless work for this center is really keep it with its vibrancy, and to all the support staff that made this event possible. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for engaging in these important issues in this series, This is America. I hope you will come back for more engaging conversations about race and racism. And in my heart, I want to dedicate this panel to a friend named Thomas Ream Cotton. He passed away due to COVID and spent 28 years behind bars. And I think the most important thing about him is that upon his release, I don't think I've experienced a better day than watching him walk as a free man into a coffee shop, Uncle Bobby's in Philadelphia, and getting to embrace him and buy him coffee. And he tirelessly worked to expose the system and to continue never to unpack and move into prison, but to be a free person, whether it was on the inside or the out. And so I hope we continue to honor his memory by fighting for justice and fighting for a better system in this world. Thank you all for coming.